The rain had already soaked through my jacket by the time she grabbed my collar, pulled me toward her, and kissed me like she had been waiting 9 years to finally stop pretending. My mind went blank. My heart forgot how to beat properly. Because the girl kissing me under that flickering streetlight was the same girl who had spent almost a decade calling me just a friend, the same girl who had stood beside me at 2 funerals, 1 graduation, 3 heartbreaks, and 100 ordinary Tuesday nights, always close enough to touch, always just far enough to never cross the line. And now, without warning, without a single word of explanation, she was crossing it. If you believe people deserve second chances, if you believe that love can survive years of silence and fear, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me you're still here, share this with someone who needs to believe in this kind of love today, and subscribe to the channel because stories like this one deserve to be heard until the very end. Her name was Mira, and I met her on the first day of college, in a lecture hall that smelled like old wood and dust, when she sat down beside me because it was the only empty seat left and asked, without even looking at me, if I had a pen she could borrow. I did not have a pen. I lied and said I did, then spent the next 10 minutes pretending to search my bag while panicking internally, until she laughed at me so hard the professor stopped talking to stare at us. That laugh became the first thing I ever loved about her, though I would not admit that to myself for a very long time. We became friends the way most real friendships happen, not through some dramatic moment but through 1,000 small ones stacked on top of each other. We studied together in the library until it closed. We shared lunch from the same tray because neither of us had enough money for 2 full meals. We walked home in the same direction even though her hostel was in the opposite direction of mine, and neither of us ever mentioned that detour out loud. By the end of the first year, we were inseparable, and everyone around us assumed we were a couple, which used to make her blush and make me laugh it off with some joke about how we were too smart to ruin a good friendship with romance. I said that line so many times over the years that I almost convinced myself it was true. But it was never true. Not for one single day. I remember the exact night I realized I loved her, because it was the same night I decided I would never tell her. It was during our second year, during exam season, and we were sitting on the roof of the college hostel because the library had closed and neither of us wanted to stop studying. She had fallen asleep with her head on my shoulder, her textbook still open on her lap, and I sat there for almost 2 hours without moving, terrified that if I shifted even slightly, I would wake her and lose this moment forever. The city lights blinked below us, and I remember thinking that if this was the only version of love I would ever get to have with her, quiet, careful, one-sided, I would still choose it over anyone else's whole heart. I never told her because I was afraid. Not afraid of rejection in the ordinary sense, though that fear was there too, but afraid of the specific, unbearable possibility that confessing my feelings would break something that had taken years to build. Mira had lost her father when she was 16, and she had told me once, in a rare unguarded moment, that the fear of losing people had made her build walls around anyone she let get close. I was one of the very few people who had gotten past those walls, and I could not bring myself to risk being pushed back out over something as fragile as a confession. So I stayed silent. I told myself that having her as a friend forever was better than risking losing her entirely for a love she might never return. The years moved forward the way years do, quietly and without permission. We graduated. We both got jobs in the same city, which felt like fate even though neither of us called it that out loud. We continued the same rhythm we had built in college, dinners twice a week, long phone calls after midnight, road trips during long weekends, the kind of closeness that outsiders could never quite categorize. Her mother started asking her when she was going to introduce a boyfriend to the family, and Mira would always say the same thing, that she was too busy for romance, that work was demanding, that she wasn't ready. I heard her say this so many times over the years that it became a kind of ritual between us, a joke we shared, though I sometimes wondered, in the quiet moments after she said it, if she was saying it for her mother's benefit or for mine. There were other people, of course. There always are, in stories like this. I dated a woman named Ritika for almost a year during our mid-20s, and I genuinely tried to make it work, because some small part of me hoped that if I built a real life with someone else, my feelings for Mira would finally fade into something manageable, something I could carry without it hurting. It did not work that way. Ritika was kind and funny and deserved someone who loved her completely, and I could never give her that, because some part of my heart was always somewhere else, at a small apartment across town, waiting for a phone call from a woman who called me her best friend. Ritika figured it out before I did. She told me, on the night we broke up, that she had always felt like she was competing with someone who did not even know she was in the race. I did not defend myself, because she was right, and I have never forgotten how much that truth cost both of us. Mira had her own version of Ritika. His name was Arjun, and he was, by every reasonable measure, a good man. He was steady and kind, he treated her with respect, and he loved her in the straightforward, uncomplicated way that people love each other when they are not carrying 9 years of unspoken history. They dated for almost 2 years, and I spent those 2 years smiling through gritted teeth at family gatherings, congratulating her on anniversaries, helping her pick out gifts for a man I quietly resented with every fiber of my being. I never let her see that resentment. I told myself that if she was happy, that was enough, that my job as her closest friend was to support her happiness even if it broke my own heart into pieces every single day. The engagement almost happened. I remember the night she called me, her voice trembling with an emotion I could not immediately place, and told me that Arjun had asked her to marry him. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed so hard against my ear that it hurt, and asked her what she had said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, longer than I had ever heard from her before, and then she said, very quietly, that she had asked for time to think. I asked her why, and she said she did not know, that something inside her felt unfinished, unresolved, like there was a question she had never answered honestly, not even to herself. I did not ask her what that question was, because some cowardly part of me already suspected the answer and was too afraid to hear it confirmed or denied. She never married Arjun. They broke up quietly, without drama, a few months after that phone call, and neither of us ever spoke about the reasons in detail. I assumed it was simply not meant to be, the way relationships sometimes are not, and I buried my hope for anything more the same way I always did, deep enough that even I couldn't easily find it. I convinced myself, once again, that this was simply the shape our lives were meant to take, two people who loved each other in the safest, quietest way possible, forever standing beside each other and never quite reaching across the small, invisible distance between us. If you have ever loved someone in silence, if you know what it feels like to protect a friendship by burying your own heart, I want you to know that this story is for you too, and I would be so grateful if you left a comment right now telling me you understand, because stories like this one are only worth telling if we tell them together. Life continued to test us in ways neither of us expected. When my mother was diagnosed with a serious illness during our late 20s, it was Mira who sat with me in hospital waiting rooms for hours, who held my hand without asking if it was appropriate, who brought food to my apartment when I forgot to eat for 2 days straight because I was too consumed by fear to remember basic things like hunger. She never once made me feel like a burden. She simply showed up, night after night, week after week, until my mother recovered, and I remember thinking, somewhere in those long hospital corridors, that I had never needed anyone the way I needed her in that season of my life, and that no romantic relationship I had ever had came close to the depth of what we shared, even without a single romantic word ever being spoken between us. When Mira's grandmother passed away 2 years later, I returned the favor in every way I knew how. I drove 4 hours through the night to reach her hometown when I heard the news. I stood beside her at the funeral, close enough that our shoulders touched, and when she finally broke down crying after the ceremony ended, when the strong, composed woman everyone else saw finally allowed herself to fall apart, she did not fall apart in front of her family or her cousins or even her mother. She turned to me, and she cried into my shoulder until her tears soaked through my shirt, and I held her without saying a single word, because I understood, even then, that some kinds of grief do not need words, only presence. It was on the drive back from that funeral, somewhere on a quiet highway at 2 in the morning, that Mira said something that I have carried with me ever since. She said, staring out the window at the darkness passing by, that she did not know what she would do without me, that I was the one constant in a life that kept taking people away from her. I told her, my hands steady on the steering wheel even though my heart was pounding, that she would never have to find out, because I was not going anywhere. She turned to look at me then, and for just a moment, a single unguarded moment, I thought I saw something in her eyes that looked like more than gratitude, something that looked almost like longing. But the moment passed, the way these moments always did between us, and she turned back to the window, and neither of us mentioned it again. Our 30s arrived quietly, the way milestones do when you are too busy living to notice them approaching. Our friends group had mostly paired off by then, married, engaged, some already raising children, and Mira and I remained the two constants at every wedding, every baby shower, every reunion, the ones who showed up together and left together, the ones everyone had long since stopped questioning because the questioning itself had become exhausting for everyone involved. I remember a mutual friend's wedding, sometime during that period, when an aunt I barely knew pulled me aside during the reception and asked me, with the blunt honesty that only distant relatives seem to possess, why Mira and I had never simply admitted we were in love with each other. I laughed it off the way I always did, some tired joke about timing and career and not wanting to ruin a good friendship, but that night, lying awake in my hotel room, I finally allowed myself to ask the question I had been avoiding for over a decade. I asked myself what, exactly, I was so afraid of losing, when the thing I was protecting had already, in every way that mattered except the physical, become the deepest love of my life. I did not find an answer that night, or the night after, or for many months following. But something had shifted inside me, some old wall had cracked, even if I did not yet have the courage to knock it all the way down. I started noticing things I had trained myself to ignore for years. The way Mira's hand would linger a half-second longer than necessary whenever she touched my arm. The way she would go quiet, sometimes, when other women were mentioned in conversation, a quietness that did not match her usual easy confidence. The way she still, after all these years, remembered exactly how I took my tea and exactly which songs made me cry, small details that friends notice but that only people who love you deeply enough choose to remember and carry. The turning point, the one that finally broke 9 years of careful pretending, came on an ordinary evening that held no warning of what it would become. It was late autumn, and Mira had asked me to help her move apartments, a task that turned into an entire weekend of carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs and assembling furniture with instructions neither of us could properly understand. By Sunday night, exhausted and covered in dust, we sat on the floor of her new living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, sharing a bottle of wine because neither of us had the energy to find actual glasses. The conversation drifted, the way it always did between us, easily and without effort, until it landed on the subject of the future, a subject we had always carefully avoided in any personal sense. Mira asked me, out of nowhere, if I ever thought about what my life would look like in 10 years. I told her the truth, that I could picture almost every detail of that future except one, the person standing beside me in it. She went quiet after I said that, quieter than I had ever seen her, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, the only sound in the room the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of traffic outside her new window. Then she asked me, her voice barely above a whisper, why I had never tried to picture someone specific standing there. I felt my heart slam against my ribs so hard I was certain she could hear it. I told her, because I had spent 9 years too afraid to say it out loud, that I had always been able to picture someone specific, and that the reason I never mentioned it was because I was terrified that saying her name would cost me the only relationship in my life I could not survive losing. She did not say anything for what felt like an eternity. She simply looked at me, her eyes searching my face for something, some confirmation or some permission, I still do not know which. And then, without a single word, she set down her glass, moved across the small space between us, and pulled me toward her by the collar of my shirt, kissing me the way I had imagined 1,000 times over 9 years and never once believed I would actually experience. When she finally pulled back, both of us breathing unevenly, tears had gathered in her eyes, and she told me, in a voice that shook with 9 years of held-back honesty, that she had loved me since the night on the hostel roof during our 2nd year of college, the same night I had thought she was asleep on my shoulder. She told me she had felt me go completely still that night, had felt my heartbeat quicken beneath her cheek, and had understood, even then, at 20 years old, that I felt something for her that I was too afraid to say. She told me she had spent 9 years waiting for me to find the courage to speak first, because she was carrying the same fear I was, the fear that naming this thing between us would break the one relationship she could not imagine living without. She told me about our June, and how the reason she had asked for time before answering his proposal was because she had realized, in the middle of planning a future with him, that she could not stop thinking about a future with someone else entirely, a future she had never once let herself say out loud. We sat on that dusty living room floor for hours after that kiss, surrounded by unopened boxes, finally saying everything we had spent 9 years too afraid to say. We talked about every missed moment, every silence that had almost become something more, every fear that had kept us circling each other without ever landing. We laughed about how obvious it must have looked to everyone around us, how an aunt at a wedding had said out loud what we ourselves had refused to admit for over a decade. We cried too, not out of sadness but out of something closer to relief, the specific kind of relief that comes from finally putting down a weight you have carried for so long that you forgot what it felt like to stand without it. What struck me most, in the weeks that followed that night, was not the excitement of finally being with the person I had loved for nearly a decade, though that excitement was real and overwhelming in its own right. What struck me most was how little actually changed between us, and how much that meant. We were still the same two people who shared lunch off the same tray, who stayed up too late talking about nothing and everything, who showed up for each other during hospital waiting rooms and funeral processions and every ordinary Tuesday in between. The only difference now was that we no longer had to pretend the depth of what we felt was something smaller and safer than it actually was. We no longer had to hide behind the word friend when the truth had always been so much larger than that word could hold. Her mother cried when we told her, not out of surprise but out of something that sounded like relief, admitting that she had always suspected there was more between us than either of us had been willing to say, and that she had simply been waiting, with the patience only a mother can hold, for us to find our own way to the truth. My own mother, still recovering from her illness, held both our hands when we told her, and said something I have never forgotten, that the best love stories are rarely the loud, dramatic ones people write songs about, but the quiet ones that survive years of fear and silence and still choose, in the end, to become brave. We got married 2 years after that night on her living room floor, in a small ceremony surrounded by the same friends who had watched us dance around each other for nearly a decade without ever saying the truth out loud. During the reception, that same blunt aunt who had confronted me at another wedding years earlier pulled me aside again, this time with tears in her eyes instead of impatience, and told me that some love stories simply need the right amount of time to become brave enough to happen. I believed her completely, because I had lived the proof of it for 9 long years. I think about that hostel rooftop often, the night I first understood what I felt for Mira and decided, out of fear, to bury it as deep as I could. I think about all the years I spent protecting a friendship instead of building the love I actually wanted, convinced that safety was more important than honesty. I understand now that fear can disguise itself as caution, that silence can disguise itself as patience, and that sometimes the very thing we are trying to protect is the thing we are slowly starving by refusing to feed it the truth. I do not regret the 9 years, not entirely, because they built something between us so deep and so tested that our love, when it finally arrived unbreakable. But I have often wondered how much pain, how many nights of quiet longing, how many almost moments on highways and hospital corridors we could have spared ourselves if either of us had simply found the courage to speak sooner. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone you have loved in silence or a truth you have been too afraid to say out loud, please do not scroll past without letting me know. Take a moment to comment below and tell me about your own story, because somewhere out there, someone reading your words might find the courage they have been waiting 9 years, or 19, or simply one more day, to finally find. Before we reach the end of this story, I want to ask you for something small but meaningful. If you believe that love like this deserves to be shared, please take just a moment right now to comment the word brave below, so I know how many of you have carried a story like this one in your own heart, waiting for the right time to become honest. Mira and I have been married for 3 years now, and there are still nights when we sit on our own rooftop, the way we did all those years ago in college, and she rests her head on my shoulder the same way she did then. The difference now is that I no longer have to hold perfectly still, terrified of breaking a moment that was never meant to last. Now I simply pull her closer, because there is nothing left to pretend, no fear left to protect, only 9 years of waiting finally rewarded with a lifetime of not having to wait anymore. And if there is one thing I hope you carry with you from our story, it is this: the people worth loving are rarely worth the years of silence we give them out of fear. Say the truth sooner than we did. Your 9 years might only need to be 1.